know what we're looking at, because it's easy to get intimidated when you're first starting to learn 3D. I know I was when I opened up a program and you see all of these buttons and all of these menus and you have no idea what's important and what's not. And it just looks like some crazy alien interface, and where do you even begin with that? So that's why I have this lesson. You can refer back to it, but it's also just kind of to ease your fears, right? Like, you're not going to need to learn every single little button and menu option here to be successful in Maya and use it. I'm going to show you the things that we use the most, and in this interface, I'm going to show you kind of how to visually categorize these things so you can kind of know, okay, I'm probably not going to use this, so visually I don't need to worry about kind of that chaos of all these buttons up here. So let's just kind of take an overall look at this. Normally when you open up Maya, you're going to get some type of a view like this. And you can see down here that it says PERSP. And that tells us the camera view that we're viewing in the viewport. And that's what this middle section is here. This is called the viewport. And you can see the axes down here on the lower left. So you can see Y is up and Z is kind of to the left. And so this is where we're going to see everything that's happening in our scene. And down here we have a timeline for when we start animating. We can scrub this, we can play it over here, we can set it to loop back several times by clicking that. We can turn on auto key, turn that off, change the frame range, all of these things. But typically when I'm using this, I use it just like this. I scrub, I look, and then I can change frame range, clicking and dragging that, or typing in numbers here. And these two numbers actually just mean the kind of in and out points of what we're looking at versus the whole scene, right? So you can see we can kind of adjust this and slide this around, but it doesn't change the first number. And that's why that's kind of the absolute values of the in and out of the scene. But we can temporarily change that kind of scale so we can see, you know, a smaller scale of the timeline. So it's easier to scrub a smaller section if it's a very big shot or something like that. And if you double click it, it will jump out to the whole thing and maximize to the entire length of the frame range that you've set. So that's the bottom part. And you can see down here in the bottom left, this will be very helpful as you're starting. This will display short help tips and tools and selections. So if I'm going up here and I don't know what this is and I hover over it, I'll get a tooltip that will pop up. But if you're looking in the lower left as well, it'll say the same thing. So if you're a little impatient for the tooltip to pop up, you can just look in the lower left and you can see as I scrub my mouse through, I'm not clicking anything, I'm just hovering over everything. You can see it's showing me what each one of these tools is named and what they do. And if you leave it over there, you know, the tooltip will also pop up. So that's one quick way to figure out what all these little things do up here. Don't worry about what each one of them does yet. We'll get into that later, but just to know, you know, these are different tabs for different kind of sections. And these sections are also kind of related to these different drop-down menus here. Maya tries to organize the menus into different disciplines. So you can see modeling, rigging, animation. It's all separated into their own menu sets because typically if you're doing one, you're not really going to be doing the other. And in a production, normally this is kind of the linear workflow of how things are made anyways. First you model something, then you rig it, then you animate it. For example, you can't really animate something that doesn't exist, so you have to model it first. And if you're going to rig it, then you need to rig it before animation. So it's just kind of, they try to do it in a way, an order that makes sense for how you're going to create things and animate things and render things. That's why these are ordered the way they are. And you can see that they change the menu options up here, but only after Windows. You can see, watch Windows, and as I change the options, Windows stays the same. So everything from File to Windows is never going to change, and everything after that will. And a lot of these things, so I'm in the animation tab here in the drop-down menu, and I'm on the animation shelf here, and you can see there's Play Blast, there's different kind of options, and a lot of those things are also here. So you can see Play Blast is here as well. It's the same icon, it's the same tooltip. So even though there's all these different buttons, they actually just put them in more than one place. So it makes it look more complicated than it is because the same option is put in several different places. So for example, with Play Blast, I could actually even right click on the timeline down here and it's off the screen. But if you do this in your Maya, you can go down to the bottom and you can see an option for Play Blast again. So Play Blast, for example, is in 3 different places. So, this is also another reason why not to get overwhelmed by all these options, because visually it looks like there's a ton of them, but really they're just the same ones over and over in different ways. Depending on how you want to work or select options or menus, or how you want to select tools, then they try to give you as many options as you want, really, which is a little too much. Typically, you're only ever going to, use this up here or the shelf. It's whatever you're comfortable with. I find it kind of hard to remember what each one of these icons are, and then to wait for the, tooltip to pop up. Typically, I'm going through the menu up here, and I'm not using this as much, but it's definitely nice to have sometimes on a couple different things, like, in this course, I'm probably going to make, a couple spheres just to show you how things work. We'll get into manipulating things in the next lesson. But, besides that, I don't really use the shelf options all that much. So now that we have this kind of shelf option and some of these menu things covered, let's look at what's in between them. We kind of see this, drop-down menu that we talked about. But then there's all these buttons up here. And they all do different types of things that we're going to get into a lot later. So for right now, just know that you don't really have to worry about any of these things, and we'll slowly cover these later. These aren't super important in getting started, so we're just going to skip them now for the interface. Don't worry about these. So the next kind of thing we want to look at are these different windows as well. So we have, a blank window here, we have blank window here, they have their own little tabs here, and then there's these tabs on the side. So again, it seems like there's a ton of options, but it's really not. So for example, with this tab, this can actually be, closed down by clicking it or double clicking it to open it back up. But if you noticed here, this little button gets highlighted and unhighlighted as we're clicking it. So it's the same thing like we were talking about earlier with the Play Blast. It's just a different way to select kind of menu options here. So you can do it from up here, or you can do it from this tab. So you can see the modeling toolkit, we can go back to the attributes, or we could select over here. So why this is significant is because if I create a sphere, this is going to tell me the name. It's going to tell me where it is in space. Is it on? Is it visible? And the history of the object and any inputs there are. So I can see what the inputs are. So this is kind of a quick way to see what's the status of this object, where it is. If I go to the attribute editor, I can kind of see this information displayed a little bit differently. So I can see, translate is all 0. If we go back to the channel box, we can see that's shown here as well. It's just the same thing shown twice, like we were talking about earlier. So I want to help simplify this stuff in your mind so you don't feel like that, this is something different than this. It's not. It's the same thing. It's just in a different place. So just to kind of emphasize this again, I wanted to show you something that I use quite a bit. If you hold down spacebar, you will get the hotbox menu, what Maya calls the hotbox menu. And I'm holding down spacebar, and I have all of the menu options available to me. You might be able to tell that it's ordered the same exact way that the tabs over here are ordered. So modeling, you can see mesh, mesh, edit mesh, mesh tools, and so on and so on. You can see rigging, animation, effects, and rendering. And that's the exact same way this is laid out over here. So it's just a quicker way to get to all of these menus is by holding down spacebar. And I use that quite a bit. It took me a couple years to get used to it and actually use it, because I think it does take a little familiarity with Maya to feel comfortable with this. But the sooner you use this, the quicker you'll be in Maya. And I would highly encourage you to use this instead of having to hunt around for stuff up here and changing menus. You can get to everything right here by holding down spacebar. So that's a pretty useful tip that I think will be useful even more later. Now that we know what the channel box is and the difference with the attribute editor, let's jump over to this section. We can see the viewport has its own options. And if you hover over each one of these objects, You'll also get the tooltip. And so I won't go over each one of these because, to be honest, they're not very helpful as a beginner starting out. These aren't really that important. But I did want to talk about the different views in Maya. So if I don't hold down spacebar and I just tap it, you can see I get multiple views. And typically what you'll see, just click this over here, is something like this when you're just starting out in Maya. So if I hit spacebar again with my mouse just hovering over a different window, I'm not clicking anything with my mouse, I can jump into those views. And you can see what the views are by the camera name: top Y, front Z, side X, perspective. And so we can jump between different perspective views. If we need to see something top down and modeling, we can do that. So that's one quick way to divide up the screen as well. So if we wanted to divide up the screen in a different way, we can go to panels, layouts, and we can say 2 panes side by side. And that's what I had earlier that you saw, because this is the way I like to animate sometimes. So I can get back to the perspective view just by hitting spacebar. And these kind of buttons over here are just kind of like shortcuts to these different modes as well. Instead of hitting spacebar, you can kind of jump through. And one of the last things I want to talk about is the outliner. And the outliner you're going to have open and spend a lot of time in because it's basically a table of contents of what's in your scene. You can see that we have these different cameras that we saw earlier when we were in the kind of 4-view setup, and they're all gray because they're hidden. We can't actually see them in the interface. So we can see the P-Sphere 1, and that's one way that we can select this object, or we can select it just by clicking it, left mouse clicking. So that's kind of 2 ways to select things, either through the outliner or through the viewport. So that is a quick rundown on the interface. I hope it got you a little more familiarized with what you're looking at when you open up Maya. It's not as intimidating as it seems. And if you follow along with this course, you will just pick up these things, and so that I won't have to walk through each little button kind of in a dry way. We'll take a project-based approach so that you'll get more familiar with the interface